Hello, Ed.
Hello, Jeff.
Hello, Dan.
Hello, Jeff and Ed.
Ed Lyons, today we are privileged and lucky to have a guest with us, Mr. Dan Kennedy. Dan Kennedy is an associate professor at Northeastern's University School of Journalism. He is a regular panelist on Beat the Press, and I think he's fresh off an appearance. We're recording this on a Friday afternoon. He was also, from 1991 through 2005, the media columnist at the now-defunct Boston Phoenix. And he is a frequent Twitter sparrer of myself and Ed over various topics, political and otherwise.
I usually agree with Ed.
And now, at the apex of his career, he is on the Lincoln Review podcast. Dan Kennedy, welcome to our podcast. How are you, sir? How are you?
I'm doing well.
Good.
Can I step in and say a few words for Dan?
Absolutely.
I'm delighted to finally meet him. He and I have talked about 6 or 7 times on Twitter, but it's nice to finally meet him. I also want to say that, for anybody who's worried about the future of journalism in this crazy time of change we're going through, Dan actually specializes in just this stuff. So all those people who have all these ideas about what the Globe should be or what should happen to radio or small papers, that Dan is not only an expert in that, but he's working on lots of things to give answers to questions about what the future is, both through his work at Northeastern and also through the Nieman Lab, which is a Harvard foundation researching, what the future of journalism looks like. So, Dan is not just kind of like an elder statesman of journalism. He's actually, trying to enable a lot of innovation out there. And I think that his opinions are unknown in that area to many ordinary people, and we should thank him for working on that stuff.
Well, thank you, Ed. I appreciate that.
Enough sucking up. We're done doing that now.
He's earned it.
No,
to be fair.
Well, my interactions with him have been mainly argumentative.
Yes.
But we're here
What
to...
a waste.
Yeah. We're here to maybe argue today a little bit, but not argue. Discuss. I like the term discuss. But I'm going to start out with a question for you, Dan. And my question is this. What is the level of political bias in the media today, primarily in the reporting, not necessarily the commentary, but if you want to kind of take a holistic approach to that, what do you think it would be? I'd say level and dive deep for us.
Well, okay. I knew you were going to ask me that. It's an old and boring topic.
It is.
But we'll run...
we Republicans, and I'm a conservative, Ed's a moderate, but we love to belabor it to death.
But we'll run through it anyway. The funny thing is I sometimes have Jeff Jacoby of the Globe come in and talk to my students about this topic because I figure
Jeff, I've invited him on the podcast to know,
Well, there you go.
I got rejected, no response. But yes, you invite him into your office.
Sure.
He was freaking terrible today, by the way. Go on.
Absolutely. And I figure give my students a different perspective from what they generally hear from me. I would say that the idea that the media are liberally biased goes back at least to 1970-71 when Vice President Spiro Agnew famously accused the media of being the nattering nabobs of negativism. And what I love about that is that, of course, he was Richard Nixon's vice president. And as I always argue, everything goes back to Nixon. Everything. By the way, Nixon has a wonderful Twitter feed. I don't know if you follow.
It is awesome.
His Twitter feed.
I do not.
It's great.
It's Dick_Nixon. I recommend it to everybody. It's what we get Twitter for. This really kind of grew through the 70s, and I think that it was a reaction to a couple of things. President Nixon often talked about the silent majority. And I think that the broad media consensus that had existed at one time began to fracture in the 60s and 70s because the silent majority was uncomfortable with the youth culture of that time, which the media was largely intrigued by, at the very least, if not outright supportive of. The media was doing extremely tough reporting on the war in Vietnam. And then, of course, there was the civil rights movement, which the media were very sympathetic with. So because of those three things, I think that we began to see a moving away of conservatives from this consensus that had existed at one time within the media.
So a move away from conservatives, or
No,
conservative?
I think that conservatives began moving away from feeling that the mainstream media of the day represented their interests and their beliefs. I think that we saw this growing in the 70s and 80s. Strangely enough, the media seemed to, a lot of us, to have bent over backwards to be fair and even supportive of President Reagan. And yet at the same time, this idea that the media were liberal continued to grow. And I think that we really saw it burst into view in the mid-90s when William Kristol, former aide to Vice President Dan Quayle and a pretty major conservative commentator in his own right.
We know who he is.
Admitted.
I'll tell a story
but
about him later.
all of your listeners don't necessarily know who he is.
You're right. Sorry.
I'm not explaining him to you.
We're going to get him, but the thing is, we're going to get a much wider audience now that Dan's on.
I'm just trying to give some context here. Kristol famously said that the idea that of liberal media bias was always kind of a crock. It was an excuse put forth by conservatives like himself to explain away their own failures. I wish I had the exact quote in front of me because it's a wonderful quote.
I will get on the phone to Bill Kristol right away and reprimand him for such
there you
a
go.
salacious comment.
He said it in the New Yorker. It's easily Googleable. Now let me just kind of skip over a lot of history and bring us up to the current moment. I think that what we see today is a national press that tends to vote Democratic, always has. That doesn't necessarily mean they're unable to do their job as unbiased reporters, but they do tend to vote Democratic. I think that the mainstream media tend to be culturally liberal in story selection, in their orientation, in the way they look at the world. But I think there's a limit to the extent to which this extends to political coverage, because I think you could also make a case that the media have always detested the Clintons, for instance. We certainly saw that during the 90s when Bill Clinton was president. Their coverage of Al Gore's campaign in 2000 was just absolutely disgraceful. I think that the memories of that have faded to some extent because there was a lot of intrigue on the part of the media. That is, I mean to say, they were intrigued by the candidacy of Barack Obama. And now we come up to this current situation that we're in which you look at liberal media commentators, conservative media commentators. There's kind of this monolithic wall of opposition to President Trump that really crosses the ideological spectrum, with a few exceptions like Fox News and Breitbart.
I'd agree with that as an analysis of current state 2017.
By the way, that was a nice concession on your part. So I'm not really into liberal bias. I'm more worried about corporate ownership of media. We'll get into that later. I think it's much more important than liberal bias right now, but I think it's a thing. And I think my biggest problem is what you're saying. It's story selection. It's the framing of issues. It's saying, well, we reporters are ready for the transgender thing, and we'll put it on the front page every single week, even though that's not where America is. So I do think that they are pushing forward in their minds, but they're not bringing the country with them, but they don't really notice that. And I think that's not bias. It's a question of sort of what their agenda is. I don't think it's nefarious, but I do think there is a framing selection issue, and you mentioned that, and I'm glad that you concede that, because some people won't even concede that, which I think is insanity. So that's great.
There's framing, there's leaving things out that are important facts of the story. I take a lot of your points absolutely critically, and I think you're on point with it, on point with a lot of what you just said. But in the reporting that I've seen, I do see significant pieces of reporting left out in important stories, in important aspects. I could mention, you're on a panelist on GBH. I could mention it with GBH. I could mention it with New York Times, and others. And the pattern of that, where they leave certain facts out, so for instance, where a person comes from or who they're associated with when as a source, or who they're connected to with this whole Trump situation now. And I don't like to get into the latest news because it changes so quickly and grows stale on our podcast. But if you said back to the 80s, what popped into my head was Peter Jennings on the nightly news, when there would be a tax cut, and say it was a 2% or 3% tax cut across the board. And Peter Jennings would lean into the camera and look and say, a tax cut that largely benefits the wealthy. Well, that's only because of math. If everybody gets a 2 or 3% cut, everybody gets a 2 or 3% cut, but because somebody who's wealthy makes more, by dollar-wise, it's more. That, to me, is, if you're going to add that kind of commentary, you should do it objectively and fairly. Now, granted, it's one example and an anecdote from the 80s and possibly the 90s.
And it's the perfect anecdote, because I have absolutely no memory of it and can't come back with you.
But it wasn't to be a gotcha situation, Dan. I'm just talking about, it's that type of thing. The most recent one was this Russian meeting with Donald Trump Jr., and I read the New York Times story, and what they did not include in their actual reporting was that this Russian figure was a member of this Fusion GPS organization, which was an Democratic opposition research firm. Now, I think that would have been an important piece of information to know that influences the story. Now, maybe they didn't know that, but I suspect that they might have, and they left that out of the story. So, things like that, where in the reporting, now, granted, the op-ed pages, I think, for decades prior to the 70s, maybe it got more intense in the 70s, definitely were liberal-leaning, and I think there's plenty of evidence for that. But that's, again, op-ed and commentary. What concerns me is the reporting, and I know on Beat the Press, you guys have covered quite a bit. I reviewed some of the old segments where you have, and let's talk the modern age. You have CNN getting many, many things just wrong. And to your credit on Beat the Press, you've talked about how you really have to check your sources, get into it more, validate that this is true, it's a legitimate source. But boy, oh boy, are they jumping the gun. And rarely is there, on TV, I don't know how you could do a retraction or fix it. But once it's out there in the ether, and they do it so many times over and over again, that's evidence to me. And I think you've had Jennifer Braceras on the show. On Beat the Press, and she mentioned something that before. It's not so much that conservatives or Republicans want to complain that there is liberal bias in the media, is that there's maybe a fair amount of dishonesty about it. Show us what angle you're coming from, and we'll know to objectively filter that. And we'll get into objectivity in a second, but I think it's important that when I read a news story or you read a news story, that it be most of the truth and not manipulated to push somebody's personal politics. I mean, would you agree with that, or am I completely wrong? Am I paranoid? Should I put on the tinfoil hat?
Well, I think that a mainstream news organization in its reporting wants to report the truth. Now, I think you mentioned two mainstream news organizations that I think have different missions. You mentioned the New York Times and CNN. Now, I do think that both of them are trying to report the truth as best as they can. The Times is, as all newspapers are today, a niche outlet whose audience is overwhelmingly liberal. So, although they are,
so you think that plays into the aspect of it, who their subscribers and advertisers are?
I'm not saying that. I don't think it shouldn't shape the way they approach any single story. I do think it shapes coverage decisions.
It shouldn't shape it, but
Oh,
do
come
you
on,
think,
it does. I have examples,
but do you
but
think
it's not
it,
worth
but
the time. Even their second public editor admitted that they were a liberal newspaper catering to their liberal audience, and he got in a lot of trouble for saying it. Dan remembers that. It was
Sure.
one of these moments.
But wait. I mean, so let's get into a philosophical discussion here
It was
about
their
that.
very first public
The
editor.
first one. I can remember where they
Yes,
first.
and-
Is
the-
that necessarily a bad thing, though? I mean, in terms of I mean,
he got in a lot of trouble for it, but he was right.
He was
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
The headline was, he wrote the headline himself, and the headline was, "Is the Times a liberal newspaper?" And then his first sentence was, "Of course it is."
See, Jeff, you missed all the good stuff.
I missed that.
Yeah, this is Dan Okrant.
I laughed out loud.
Yeah,
when I read that.
the inventor of rotisserie baseball, by the way.
Really?
Yes, he is.
I didn't know that.
Yep. Now, CNN, on the other hand, I don't think that they are trying to serve an explicitly liberal audience. I think they're a huge news organization that does many things. They do some things well. They do a lot of things badly. CNN drives me crazy sometimes.
What are the, well? Let's get in. What are some of the good? What are some of the bad?
Well, I think that some of their reporting, some of their hosts are very good. I think I love Christiane Amanpour, but of course you have to figure out how to tune in CNN International to see
she's
her
on at
anymore.
odd times.
I like Brian. I think Brian Stelter's an excellent media reporter and commentator. What drives me crazy about CNN is when they have the 14-member panels during prime time. It just drives me out of my mind.
Yeah.
But on top of that, CNN has made a lot of mistakes over the years. Maybe it's because they're just on the air all the time and you're going to make a lot of mistakes. But it just seems that there's a lot of things you can point to where they have made errors. Of course, one of the most famous errors that they made, both CNN and Fox News falsely reported that the Supreme Court had overturned the Affordable Care Act. And CNN fell on their sword and apologized and corrected it. And Fox News said, "We didn't make a mistake." And they made the same mistake.
You like Jake Tapper?
I like Jake Tapper quite a bit. I think he's very good.
He's been exemplary in the past few years. I think he's stood out, but he's stood out because he's been so good.
Yeah.
But it's almost like the.
I think Anderson Cooper's very good. Unfortunately, because he's on in prime time, it is often his unfortunate duty to preside over these 12-member panels.
Well, I've been on those panels before. I mean, I did a lot of election coverage last year for NECN, and what's bad about that, what the current paradigm of media, and especially political media, is the fact that you get about 8 minutes, if you're lucky, to talk about very complex topics and issues, and don't get to dive deep, which is why I created this podcast, because I want to be able to just dive and pick apart an issue and unpack it if we need to. And I think the shift to new media is going to lead more in this direction somehow, organically. But everybody just talks over each other, spits out their talking points. They know. I know what I'm going to say going into them. I know how much time there is. I know what the topics are going to be. Maybe somebody's going to throw me a curveball because I'm the Republican and they're going to try to change the topic. But still, it's bad. It's just bad.
It's a game show.
It is a game show. It's a bad game show too. I think
But
we're all whereas you want to be smarter at the end of the day, we're all dumber. I think.
But the bigger the panel, the worse it is. And
Yes.
CNN just goes with these massive
10 people.
panels.
Yeah, there's 10 people.
And I think that they are missing an opportunity because to me, Fox News and MSNBC are unwatchable. And CNN has an opportunity to do something different. And it is different in the sense that, oh, look, we're balanced. We have liberal and conservative panelists. But I'd rather have news.
Yeah.
I'd rather have news than all this talk.
But there's no money in news, right? They've learned.
Well,
but
this
these
is-
people are not
yeah, go ahead.
amateurs at working at their own business model. They've done the research. We're 25 years into this experiment with cable TV being kind of this aggressive profit-making enterprise. I think they're acting rationally. What they're really trying to do is trying to position themselves in the current television media ecosystem. And it's not about following some North Star about quality journalism and all of that, which is why I don't watch television. The only TV I watch the NewsHour.
But he
video
loves to
feeds.
criticize Fox News. He doesn't watch
I see
television.
it at the gym,
for-
and it's terrible.
Yeah,
I
right.
won't watch Fox.
I'll
And
criticize Fox, but I actually.
So young
view it.
people often ask me, like, what
Right.
my media diet is because they're looking for some guidance the way that your students are, although I'm not as qualified as you, that I get asked a lot.
Yeah.
And I tell them, like, I prefer the PBS NewsHour, or I mentioned, ProPublica and all that. And Republicans say, well, they're Democrats. And my answer is always, I'd rather Democrats try and tell me the truth than Republicans who aren't. And actually, I even tell them I think that the liberal conservative bent of certain organizations is way less important than what the mission of the organization is, what their corporate ownership is, and what their priorities are. I said, growing up, I said my father and I would watch Walter Cronkite. My father was an uneducated conservative,
Yep.
a Goldwater man, but he didn't own a book, but he was a construction worker and a janitor, but like he was sort of a Buckley fan. He'd turn on Firing Line and feel smart. He was smart.
Yep.
And he would watch Walter Cronkite. I'm like, Dad, is Walter Cronkite a Republican? He's like, no, but he's really trying, so it's okay.
Yep.
And the point is that we were getting the news that Walter Cronkite wasn't clubbing us over the head with his viewpoint, and it was worth it.
But that was back when a time when news organizations ran at a loss.
Generally,
Correct?
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they were financially not profitable, but the networks knew that, and were willing to sort of subsidize it at the for the general public as a public service.
Don Hewitt, the founder of 60 Minutes, said, in retrospect, the worst thing he ever did was turn 60 Minutes into a profit center. Because he said now, after that, the network executives said, well, we should demand a profit from all our news programming.
Ugh. But that would have happened anyway.
Yeah.
So
It would've.
I think so. I want to ask one more question about the objectivity, and then I want to get into a bit of the corporate part and how it plays out here in Greater Boston. Is objectivity kind of over? So when I took journalism classes, it was still the old school of objectivity is sort of this like Zen state of mind you got into, and that everybody's aiming for it. And I'd meet these journalists who work for the Harvard Courant who would say like, "Oh, I don't vote, I don't get involved in all this. I'm above all
I've
of
interviewed
this."
journalists that say that.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but Dan wrote a nice book called Wired City about kind of using the New Haven as a microcosm of kind of the economics of journalism and how different papers operated in the time frame that he wrote about. It's a very good book. And he does say in there that objectivity has sort of divided reporters from audiences and communities. It's kept them out of things unnecessarily. And I like to tell the story that when my father started his janitorial business, there was an article in the local paper saying, like, here's Ed Lyons. My father was named Ed too. He's opening this business, and good luck, Ed. It was sort of this nice thing. And I thought, like, papers today wouldn't wish luck to a new businessman in a news story. But why don't they? Like, what? I tell my friends at the Globe, I'm like, you become so aloof that you're not compelling anymore. Well, and then one more thing. And then, so fast forward, now we have Glenn Thrush covering Donald Trump, trashing him on Twitter at the same time. And I want to say, but yet Glenn Thrush is saying, I'm going to be compelling and build a huge audience and sell more newspapers by being out there and being controversial, where that person in that job 10 years ago would never be on Twitter criticizing the person he was covering. So taking the gamut of I'm the high priest who is too pure for politics to Glenn Thrush trashing Twitter while he's trashing Trump while he's covering him, I want to say, like, if the audience has stopped believing in sainted objectivity, is it more important to be compelling with upfront biases than it is to aim for this fairness? Since you've written about it, what's your take of where are we right now on this spectrum?
Define objectivity.
Oh.
Objectivity is that a neutral person would agree you're being fair. That's how I would look at it.
So it's balance.
Yeah.
Okay. That's not objectivity.
Okay.
That is what objectivity has come to mean, and I think it's why the idea of objective journalism became so discredited, because people don't understand what it is. The idea of objective journalism was something that was written about in the 1920s by Walter Lippmann, one of the big giants in our field. He was active from the teens through the 60s, but in the 20s he talked about a scientific approach to journalism. And at the heart of this was objectivity. And by objectivity, he meant pursuing the truth in a way that was fair and free of bias. Like, you might go into reporting a story thinking that I'll make something up, that the water is polluted because this factory over there has been dumping water into the river, and then you look into it, and your reporting reveals that that's not why the water's polluted. It's actually polluted because there's 100 years worth of industrial chemicals that were dumped there before that factory ever came along. That's just an example. So the idea is you then report the best available version of the truth. And it isn't a matter of, okay, I have somebody telling me that the sun rises in the east. I better balance that by finding somebody who's going to tell me that the sun rises in the west. It's pursuing the truth in an objective way and then presenting your findings.
So the truth is an objective thing.
The truth is an objective thing, yes. But balance, you don't do balance if there's no balance.
Like saying climate change is true and untrue. That's
right.
not balance, of course.
Exactly. I used the sun rising in the east and the west to stay away from that. But yeah, fundamentally, that's exactly the case. There is a wonderful book that it's a standard book in our field. I don't know if you've ever read it. The Elements of Journalism by Bill Kovach and Tom Rosensteel.
I'm a big fan of Tom Rosensteel.
It's great, and I assign it to my students. And what's interesting is that they have 10 elements of journalism, and objectivity is not one of them. And they explain that that's because objectivity has become a parody of what it was originally meant to mean. The most important element of journalism is that they say journalism's first obligation is to the truth. It is and I love this phrase, it is a discipline of verification. And journalism has to maintain its status as an independent monitor of power.
So I agree largely with what you said. I think there's a recent example that I can think of locally that really hasn't been talked about enough. After Donald Trump got elected, there was a couple of kids over, I want to say, what is the college? Begins with a B, not
I know the
Bryant,
story,
Bryant.
yes.
So a couple of Bryant students, maybe they were Republican, just Trump fans, went around and celebrated.
This, by the way, this made it into the WGBH News Muzzle Awards this year.
You know what? I'm thinking that's why it popped in the top of my head.
It was the campus edition of the Muzzle Awards, which my friend Harvey Silverglate writes.
Yes. I encourage everybody to subscribe to Adam Riley and Peter Katzis' podcast, The Scrum Podcast, available on iTunes, just like the Lincoln
They have the best
Review.
guests.
They do have the best guests. We're still the most listened to episode
Except for
in
one.
the year.
Except
No,
for one.
well, maybe ever, but definitely this year. We did a appearance on there. Anyway, so Dan covered it in the Muzzle Awards. The story of a couple of Bryant students, I think that was the college, and they went.
I can't remember what college.
But they went over to Wellesley, and they drove around in a pickup truck, and just hooting and hollering, just saying "Yay, Trump." But honestly, that was about it. That's all they said. And the initial 2 to 3 reports out of the Boston Globe said that they shouted racist things, they shouted sexist things, they shouted all this kinds of stuff that was literally untrue. It was never corroborated, never backed up. And I think by the time it got to the second or third story, their names were printed in the paper. And they really hadn't investigated it any further. So it comes to the point, I mean, I agree with everything what you said, but there's this human aspect of it where the human beings are reporting what's going on in the story, and they're viewing it through their own eyeballs and their lens of their own experience.
Well, they're reporting what people told them.
Well, they are reporting what people told them, but isn't it the job of a journalist to say, okay, well, is that true?
Yes, of course it is. And
Yeah,
unfortunately,
truth is why
there's got to be a balance between exploring every last element of a story, so that you have really nailed it as best as you possibly can, and the need to do other stories. That's not like the only story that you can report in the next day's paper. You've got to report other stories too. So unfortunately, what does happen is, I don't think this is a matter of bias. I think it's a matter of the sort of superficial reporting that often takes place for stories that are, news of the day.
So you think it's a lazy reporting has a...
no,
I'm saying lazy. You're not saying
You're
lazy.
saying the lazy. I'm saying superficial of the sort that often takes place with the news of the day. And then what happens is 2, 3, 4 days later, you start to find out that there were other elements of the story that you missed. And at that point, you do have to go back and correct the record and do more reporting. Because, when you do this level of reporting, most of the time, the sort of superficial, quick reporting that you're going to do is going to turn out to be accurate. And you move on to another story, and that's that. But sometimes, and this is a good example of that, it's a good example you brought up, Jeff, sometimes it turns out that what was initially, what the reporters were initially told did not turn out to be true. I mean, if you're talking about lazy reporting, technically every item that you report from the local police log, you ought to check in with the people who got arrested and their family, and that doesn't happen.
But let's extrapolate that. I want to go into Ed's Globe example next.
I can give lots of examples.
Go ahead.
But
we'll go to that. But I'm gonna wind down with this.
I'm not going to give lots. I meant the fact that the Globe is always erring in the direction of its biases.
But this is what I'm saying. Okay, so we have that as an example, and I'm not doing this to rattle off a litany of errors. What I say, so those reporters may have said, "Oh my goodness, what a terrible event." These people are saying this. It's reported. They're going on what they've told.
It is confirmation bias to the extent
Right.
that it sounds
Absolutely.
true.
Right.
It sounds true.
So, for instance, and so what concerns me, and it does concern me, is when I read a report about business or economics, and they just go to one or two economic sources that kind of agree with that, or healthcare. They go to one or two sources that kind of agree with the narrative of the healthcare story that they're doing. So while they may not even, I say, it's that unconscious bias. That's what concerns me, and those types of things don't get necessarily corrected. Now, in the first example I gave with the college students, that is. But Ed, I know, wants to talk about something that lately that's been in the Globe, kind of a recurring theme that reflects that a bit. And I want to get your thoughts on not necessarily what to do about it, but how it should be treated or viewed. Not that, because everybody's free to run their newspaper or
I mean,
go ahead.
Let's not believe this. Or what is the solution, right? So I think most of the errors are due to speed. I think that when I'm working on, being a journalist today is not like it was 25 years ago. Every journalist I know is working on 4 things at once. The deadline is 3 hours from now. And when I was at UConn, we had this journalism class called Journalism 211, and one of the products they had was you had to get a topic in the morning and follow the story by the end of the day in 6 hours. And this was radical. Follow a story in 6 hours. Supposed to say, well, it's not like this in the real world, but learn, you may have to do a story inside of 1 day. And I laugh and say, what sudden death is now like the normal, or actually it's longer than what you get in the real world. And the problem is, if you get a story, you have 3 hours, there are gaps, you fill it in with your own beliefs because you're in a hurry. I say, when you're in a hurry, you trip over your own biases, no matter who you are. I think the problem is speed. The problem is what the mission of the organization is. I think that if somebody had to sit down and work on that story about the flag over a whole day, they might have said, but did they say that? Does that make sense? The Globe is constantly making little errors in the direction of their own biases on gentrification, on stories about race. They goof over and over and over and over and over again, but they're so put upon, they don't have the luxury of waking up in the morning and saying, maybe last night I was wrong about that. That's not how they operate. Speed kills, and CGR has written about this many times. Speed is the enemy here. It's what the business model is and how these people have to do so much work. So I don't think the answer is cataloging it all, because everybody who has to move fast is going to make these same mistakes. You're just picking what kind of mistakes you get based on who the people are that are doing the stories. I mean, the Wall Street Journal makes mistakes. The Boston Herald is nothing but mistakes, right? Where the Boston Globe is making mistakes, but I know what they are. I'm ready for them in a way that I'm also ready for what the Boston Herald is doing. So I think the answer is, how do you get slow journalism? How do you find thoughtful pieces where that's far less likely to happen? So I don't think it's a question of policing it. I think it's recognizing, if I'm going to pay nothing for my newspaper that I visit in incognito mode, and as a result, the reporters are running around doing 10 stories, I can expect a lower quality product than if I fork over some money to people that can sit down and think about something.
Well,
I think the
Globe
answer is
actually
paying for
figured that
journalism.
out. I read that the other day.
I know,
more,
it's
no
great.
more
They killed it, thank
incognito
God.
mode. But Dan, sorry.
Well, you raise many issues, and I can't necessarily address all the issues that you raise. But one of the things that really does occur to me that we can do a much better job of, and it's something that my Beat the Press friend Callie Crosley talks about all the time, is we have a tendency to go back to the same sources over and over. We have our go-to sources.
Yeah.
And we go to them because they give good phone, as they say. They're easily reachable. They give good pithy quotes. They make sense, and we've got our story, and we move on. And they return our calls.
That's huge.
Right.
That's huge. But what Callie points out is that we all need to be developing a much broader range of sources, and a lot of that would have to do with diversity of viewpoint. And I don't necessarily mean opinion, but maybe people who are at a different point in the food chain on any particular story.
By the way, Jeff and I are always available for our viewpoint, for all the if they make newspapers are feeling like they don't have our point of view.
If you ever have a Charlie Baker quote,
Right.
you want to know what's really going on.
Right. No, exactly.
us.
But I mean, Jeff raised the issue of business stories having one or two sources. Well, maybe some people who were more involved in actually running a business were quoted
than the head of the Chamber of Commerce
on a fairly regular basis,
or a professor of economics rather than I get you, but I get you.
And I think that gets at least a little bit of what you're talking about. But the problem of speed is not going to go away. The problem of having to crank it out is not going to go away. Right. But I think that we can take more care about who we're going to for our information, and are we always going back to the same people, or are we broadening out the people that we talk to?
Fair enough. I wanted to shift a little bit into the future of media. Not amazingly enough, the New York Times is now turning a profit, from what I understand.
The Washington Post.
Okay. Well, they've got the money of God behind them now.
But they're turning a profit. That's the thing.
But they become profitable off of the combination of print and especially the digital revenues.
Right.
The New York Times does not publish their financials, as Dan knows, but that they.
But they're doing okay.
They're doing okay.
Well, I remember when I was consulting at the Globe in the back of the house, the business side. I wrote up a report of what they could do to improve the whole way the operation is run, and a lot of that they've actually executed. But do you see a shift to more of the past, where a news organization become more of a loss leader than the for-profit model we have currently, or is it just, you guys, through subscriptions and ads, you got to figure out how to make money, or like any organization, it has to run a profit or a surplus. It just does. Which, by the way, as a economic fiscal conservative, that's philosophical. Any organization, barring a charity, needs to run a surplus, and even charities need to run a surplus or break even.
Well, you said, can news organizations become a loss leader? For who?
Some parent organization.
For a parent organization. I mean, that's certainly possible. And, an example of that could have been the Washington Post being a loss leader for Amazon.
Right.
Since Jeff Bezos now owns both of them. By the way, I should say he owns the Washington Post as a personal holding. Amazon's a publicly traded
the Post
corporation.
was a loss leader. The Post was a loss leader for a for-profit chain of colleges. Dan remembers when they were part of a media empire where the for-profit, I don't know if it was Drexel, I forget who it was. They were in the same company as a for-profit college, was making all the money, and the Washington Post was losing all the money, and then they separated later on. But the Post was a loss leader for a for-profit school chain that went bankrupt years later. I don't mean loss leader. I think that's the wrong word. I think it's a question of...
In fact, Ed, the Post did lose money for a few years during the worst of the recession of the late 2000s. But by the time it was sold to Jeff Bezos, the Post itself was turning a profit.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and then I imagine it went negative again because Jeff Bezos invested so much money in the Post.
Oh, a lot of spending.
Infrastructure and things.
Yeah,
hires.
But then at the end of 2016, the Post announced that it was profitable. Now it's a little hard to know what that means because they don't report any numbers.
But let's take them at their word. So there's one organization out there that is now runs a surplus, runs a profit, which is good.
Yeah.
But but we look at it because it's that legacy media operation.
Right.
It was a newspaper, a physical paper, still printed, but now online, and they figured out subscriptions. Excuse me for there. But what do you see the future of it being? So, for instance, I love to push our podcast as the place to go for if you want intelligent commentary. There's going to be audiences. The democratization of media, and when I say media, in terms of my computer here, software, video, has become so much more cheaper. I can record a high quality audio podcast for pennies on the dollar of what it would have cost a few decades ago. So in terms of that democratization, you can have commentary of a video, audio to compete. Podcasts compete with NPR now. Podcasts, videocasts compete with television because you only have 24 hours in a day.
Right.
So there's that aspect of it. Print, there's all kinds of blogs, but there's also purely website driven. I mean, the Huffington Post is the most famous one where it was never a physical paper. Where do you see all of that going into the future? Because TV ratings are, they're spending a lot. I don't mean they...
Jeff, somebody actually has to investigate whether or not that the for-profit funeral homes, in your area are actually scamming people. That Dan last week highlighted 2 excellent stories about regional journalism and something else I remember. And that somebody actually has to do the shoe leather reporting on whether or not that your congressman is corrupt or not. So yes, the world of commentary is going to be this crazy free-for-all, but who's going to pay for these long investigations about otherwise mundane government things? I mean, that there's no business model right now for that work. I want to hear Dan's opinion on this. You can't go anywhere in this store without talking about philanthropy in some way, directly, indirectly. I want to ask later on whether you think the Globe should adopt the Philadelphia Inquirer's business model, where you have this kind of a non-profit owning a for-profit and funneling donations. I think the Globe should do that. I want to ask you about that later. I think I think it's okay to comment on what Jeff said about what does the future look like in terms of kind of the more desirable stuff. But what is the future around the Globe actually covering the State House, which they don't, right? What is the future about the actual investigative journalism? I see nothing but philanthropy everywhere for all of this. I think I'm actually for it. I think it's fine. I'm curious, how do you see the media market evolving, say 15 years from now? How do you see philanthropy playing into that? And sort of, what is the, I joke with Jeff, I'm Boston released this new 2030 plan about our housing and infrastructure in 2030. What does the greater Boston media ecosystem look like in 2030? Who's there, and who pays for it all? You're the expert on
Holy
this.
crap, Ed. You've given him 60 questions. Settle down and let the man answer.
This is what the man does, though.
Let the man answer.
That is about 60 questions. I just finished another book. And
would you like to plug it? Let's plug it.
And I would like to plug it, although it won't be out till next year.
That's all right.
It's called The Return of the Moguls, and it deals with these very issues because I take a look at 3 newspapers that acquired wealthy owners and how they have fared under those wealthy owners. So it's the Washington Post under Jeff Bezos, the Boston Globe under John Henry.
Philly, in Philadelphia, right?
And no, not Philadelphia, although I did do some reporting in Philadelphia for the book. He is a billionaire. The Orange County Register under Aaron Kushner.
Okay.
He was a very big deal a few years ago.
Any relation?
No, he's
Okay.
no relation to Jared
bad one.
Kushner. Well, if you took a job at the Orange County Register and got laid off 6 months later, you might think Aaron Kushner's the bad one. So, although it's interesting that they're both media entrepreneurs in a way, isn't it? Let me give a.
I think he was a terrible media boss, by the way.
Let me give a little bit of background on how we got to where we are, because if you will sometimes hear people say that the original sin of the newspaper business was giving away its journalism. They never should have done that. I would argue that at the time, it seemed like a good idea at the time. It turned out to be wrong, but it seemed like a good idea.
was so
at the
wrong.
time.
Well,
It was so wrong.
just quickly define giving away journalism.
What I mean is, starting in the mid-'90s, just about every newspaper launched websites and posted all of their journalism online and gave it away for free.
Other than the Journal.
Other than the printed paper.
Online. The
Online.
version was free. Other than the Wall Street Journal, which charged from day one, God bless them.
Yeah.
Other than everyone else was giving it away.
Yep, they're all giving it away.
No, what I meant was whatever they printed in the physical paper,
Right.
they copied in the online.
And
all right, got it.
And as time went on, they might have added a few additional features, but basically they were giving away the paper online. Now, you look back, and traditionally, advertising pays for 85% of a newspaper's revenues. And the 15% that the customers pay for is really just covering the cost of printing and distribution. So in a way, the news was always free to the customers. And so newspapers said, look, if we can eventually get rid of the cost of printing and distribution, why shouldn't we give it away? We're going to have these wonderful multimedia ads. We're going to own the classified market just as we always have, and everything's going to be wonderful. And, of course, we know what happened. Monster.com, Craigslist come along, and overnight...
And Google commoditizing all the ads in the world.
Yeah.
And overnight destroyed the classified market.
Right.
So you've still got the display ads. Well, the display ads do not work anywhere near as well online as they do in print. I'm going to give you a absolutely bone-chilling statistic from Nico.
Let me finish my beer first.
From Nico Melli, who is the director of the Shorenstein Center at Harvard, but he was the deputy publisher of the LA Times a few years ago. He said that if you bought a full-page ad in the print edition of the LA Times, it would cost you $50,000. If you bought an ad at latimes.com that reached the same number of people, $7,000. So now you've got... I'm not done.
It gets worse.
You get from $50,000 to $7,000. Now let's say you're unable to sell that space. And all you have to do is even look at good quality websites like the New York Times and the Washington Post to see that they do have a hard time selling this space. And
a lot of house ads.
A lot of house ads, but a lot of programmatic ads fed in from Google.
Yep.
And you run a programmatic ad from Google that reaches the same number of readers. $20 if you're lucky.
Really?
So now you've gone from
it's
$50,000 down to $20. So what you've seen in the last 4, 5, 6 years is newspapers embracing the idea that we have to sell digital subscriptions. That's why they have moved away from the free model. And interestingly enough, these 3 publishers who I looked at all came on the scene just as everybody was beginning to understand that, you know what, we've hit the end of free, and we're going to need to come up with new ways of charging for news.
I am a subscriber to the Boston Globe, so I subscribe to a newspaper. I think it's the only... Well, actually, I mean, I subscribe to a couple other outlets, but... I mean, where your
subscribe to about
subscription?
20 different ones. I donate money every month to ProPublica. I spend about $200 a month on journalism because I believe that it matters. I tell my friends, I'm like,
that's too much.
Well, but the point
That's
is,
too much.
But the
I
point
can't spend that much.
I just meant that I believe in this, and you have to pay for it. I have so many friends who are journalists.
Okay.
I don't think they like me as much if they knew that I didn't do this.
So the subscription model is bolstering the legacy organizations.
That's really the last. It's really the last strategy that they have.
Right.
And you see that the New York Times and the Washington Post have had decent success with this. The Globe is having some success with it.
They're the best Metro paper in the entire country. Like the Metro, just for our audience, Metro is sort of the sub New York Times, Washington Post is about 7 or 8 papers that are considered Metro-sized papers, and the Globe leads with 84,000 subscribers. And you figure that since you pay them about $1 a day, that they're making $84,000 a day based on their subscription. Now, what's interesting is, I agree. I think it is the last thing. Although Jay Rosen, a professor that Dan knows, I don't really know him that well. He's got funding to do a study of membership, and I agree with his direction. He's saying that it can't be just subscriptions. We have to move away from that mentality, and he's studying organizations, museums, other things. People sort of pay memberships to sort of change the thinking around paying for newspapers. I'm curious to see what Jay comes up with about that model. I have lots of other ideas for money, premium services. I've talked to them at the Globe.
Well,
but the people are going to have to pay. Philanthropists.
Well, let's get back to your other questions, the litany of 60 questions that you had for Dan. So, I mean, the subscription model for large organizations is obviously something, they made the mistake. They thought they had it too big a head at the time with the classified ads. They thought that could sustain them for a long time. Obviously, it didn't go that way. More subscription model. What else? What about the local?
If you're Bill Forey, what do you do?
Yeah.
So Bill Forey is the editor-in-chief of the Dorchester Reporter. So if you're one of those people, what do they do?
I think with Bill Forey with the Dorchester Reporter, well, first of all, neighborhood papers like the Dorchester Reporter still do pretty well in print, and I don't think that the print model is anywhere near exhausted for
those people.
Because you've got neighborhood businesses that can advertise, and fundamentally
it's more place-oriented.
It's more place-oriented.
But those are freebies, right, on the corner stand, like a Dorchester Reporter?
Well, some are, some aren't.
Okay.
I love Bill. I honestly don't know whether the Reporter is paid or free.
Okay.
I don't think you pay for it.
All right.
You don't pay for it? We've also got some great Northeastern students working there. I just want to say
Bill's
that.
a great guy. I'm always happy to plug in.
Absolutely.
Married to Counselor Linda Dorsina Forey.
Now State Senator.
State Senator, excuse me, you're right.
Linda Dorsina Forey, that's right.
But even Bill must know that the days of these are numbered. He's not going to be able to hand out papers. Look, here's an example. One example I talk about in terms of this issue is college newspapers. Since I worked for one, was on a board for one, and I had these people who don't know anything, saying, if newspapers could just really commit to digital and have a digital mindset, they'd be fine. And what I say, which no one says, not even on your show, is that Dan knows this, the college newspapers are all going under too. And what I say is, if this was about being digital, the college newspapers who have the ultimate staffing and the ultimate audience will be making a fortune, but they're all dying. They're all turning to philanthropy. Dan knows all about this. But more people have to say, stop beating up the Globe for not being digital enough. That doesn't explain why the Free Press was going under at BU. It doesn't explain why Northeastern's paper. I helped the Delhi campus, my college newspaper, go to digital. I didn't help them because they still had, they don't even have the legacy costs of all the big newspapers, and they're still failing. So I think we have to stop saying that papers have to get digital, because the college papers, even in this area, are showing us that's not true. And so what you want to say is that if you're Bill Forey, you're saying we're eventually going to get to a point like the college papers, because the college papers, as Dan knows, stayed printed longer because they could put them in cafeterias, in dorms. Oddly enough, they had the most digital readership in the world, but they also sat in the cafeteria and read the printed papers. But now the kids are on their phones instead of eating their breakfast in the cafeterias, so therefore the printed papers are being left in stacks in the cafeterias. Dan knows this. So I want to say that this isn't about being digital. It's saying that no matter how you get your cost model down, even if you're the voice of San Diego, you still have to get money from somebody, right?
You've got to get money from somebody, and the fact is, print advertising is still valuable.
For certain papers.
So for all papers.
If you can get it.
Even the Washington Post makes most of its money from advertising in the print edition.
Well, that was the thing, yeah.
To this day, absolutely.
When I was consulting at the Globe, they would.
I know it's true for the Globe still.
The print made way more. But the problem was they were still chasing the infrastructure of it. I won't get into it.
No,
but Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, you sometimes hear people say, "Well, newspapers should just abandon print and go all in for digital."
It's BS.
And so what I say is, why? If they're, I mean,
The money's real.
The moment that it no longer makes economic sense for them to do that, don't worry, they'll abandon print.
Right.
Look what happened. The Globe couldn't deliver their papers. Everyone's shut down because, oh my God, that proved it.
Yeah, you complained about that on Twitter.
That's right.
When they had their big shutdown, even their Katie is out delivering newspapers as a Pulitzer Prize winner because this is literally how she gets paid.
That's right. I don't know what they're going to do the next time because she's no longer at the Globe.
I know. Well, she and I are friends.
Who are we talking about?
Katie Kingsbury. She was
okay.
she's been a lot of things. She won the Pulitzer Prize. She deserved it. She also recently became the vice president in charge of the whole digital operation. Then she announced 2 weeks ago that she is going to be the deputy editor for the New York Times opinion section, which is funny because in my
Boy, do
opinion,
they need help. I hope they understand how much they need her help.
Who, you mean the New York Times?
Yeah.
Yes, they do. The New York Times in my opinion, has the opposite problem of the Globe. In the Globe, the editorials are better than the columns. In the New York Times, the columns are better than the editorials.
Unless you
in my
read
opinion.
Michael Cohen.
And they do need her help, and I think she could really help them because Katie is a fantastic editorial writer, and the editorials in the New York Times are not fantastic. And so I look forward to seeing what she does. But she does
Not fantastic is a good description.
they're terrible. And by the way, Dan Kennedy has announced that the New York Times editorials are not fantastic, and he would agree with the opinions of the people who write them where I think they're crazy.
All right.
It's a quality problem.
We're running out of time, and we don't want to consume too much of Dan's weekend.
Let's go back to the future and the Globe. Since you read about the Globe a lot, the Globe is the sun around which everything is revolving in Boston. When I read your book, I'm thinking, Dan has so many great ideas about journalism. The Globe seems to be listening to none of it, and I think that's really interesting that they don't listen to you. Although they are at least moving downtown, and you wrote in your book that when you thought that the New Haven Register and others left the downtown, they lost something. First question, do you think the Globe will gain something by moving back to the city in terms of
good question.
not doing stories
That's
over
a
the
good
phone?
question.
It would play into your opinion that newspapers lost something when they left the cities. Will the Globe gain from going from Morrissey Boulevard to State Street?
To cut them a little bit of slack, they were still in the city. They were in Dorchester at their building. So
I
they're not
wouldn't
downtown.
count that as the city.
Yeah, talk to the people in Dorchester. It still is, but we get it downtown.
Well, they were geographically in Dorchester, but they weren't of Dorchester because it was just kind of cut off
I think that's
Morrissey
the point.
Boulevard
and
the
93 on the other side of 93 in the ocean.
I think it's a great thing that the Globe has moved back downtown. I think it will benefit them in the long run, but I also think it's very different from the benefit you get when a small paper moves to the downtown of their small city. Because then you've kind of got a storefront, people from the community can come in. You have I remember this from my days at the Woonsocket Call in the 1970s and the Woburn Daily Times in the 1980s. People can just wander in, and it's a great thing. I don't think you're going to see a lot of that at the Globe.
I am totally wandering in.
But you'll see more of that. I think you'll see more of it.
I hope they don't have security.
You'll see more of it. Well, of course they'll have security.
In this day and age, that's a wrong thing to say.
They better have security.
Yeah.
But no, I think it's a good thing, absolutely. And I think a lot of papers made that move prematurely. Not the Globe, because they did it in the 50s. But there were papers that did it in the 70s and 80s.
The New Haven Register did it in the 80s.
Yeah.
And you said that was wrong.
If they had just waited a few years, they would have been able to transmit their pages electronically. I remember when we did that in Woburn. We moved to this office park, and before that, we had been trying to transmit pages around our various bureaus. Not pages, but just copy, using the acoustical couplers, and it just didn't work. But in just a few years, we could have built a printing plant 12 miles out from the city. It didn't have to be in Woburn at all, and we could have kept our downtown location. But people weren't able to see that was what was coming next.
So the Globe has moved downtown. I personally love John Henry. I'm glad he owns the paper. I have not seen any innovation. I have not seen leadership the way Jeff Bezos brought to the Washington Post. I know many people at the Globe. They're trying to move forward. They're experimenting. There is no sense the fact that they have any urgency in moving to the future. So I'm a Globe subscriber. I love them. Please subscribe to them. But I feel like that John Henry has been, even though I've heard this will change as of this week, has been sort of an absentee landlord to the Globe, in my opinion. and now we hear it's going to be more involved day to day. So what do you think is wrong with the Globe? And I'm not going to ask you how to improve the Globe per se, but what could the Globe do that would help everybody else? If they are the thing everybody orbits around, where you guys get your topics for all of your shows across the street and all that, if they are the sun, how can they be a better sun for the solar system that is Greater Boston?
Okay. Well, I guess I would look at it, first of all, journalistically, and second of all, as a business. And looking at it as a business, they have bet the farm on digital subscriptions, and I don't think they've invested enough in technology.
Absolutely not. I'm a technologist.
Their website isn't bad.
It's not great.
But it's not great, and there really isn't anything good for mobile.
Sucks on mobile.
It's,
qualified to say that.
I mean, we mentioned Katie Kingsbury. I told her once that, I'll read generally the Washington Post and the Globe. Those are my two reads. I'll read the Globe at home because I've got the access that I need. I don't want to try.
Dan goes wrong every day.
I don't want to try. I don't want to try to read the Globe on the train, and then I'll read the Post on the train because the app works so well.
It's so fast.
And it's so fast. You try to read the Globe on the train, you get the responsive website. If you don't have good constant internet access, you can't even read it. So I really think that they need to improve their digital products. The Post, people have said, the Post has a product mindset. And I think the Globe needs to have more of a product mindset.
Just a quick reminder for the listening audience of many people at the Globe. Both Ed and I are technology professionals and do this for a living. We do technology for a living. So from that perspective. But okay, so as far as the infrastructure, beyond that, just the general look and feel, the consumption of it. Yeah. But let's get into content. Or did you want to get
journalism and the business models? How do you think they're doing on the journalism?
So what about the content?
What I find in the Globe today is, Brian McGrory, the editor, has talked about this quite a bit. We're no longer a paper of record. We have to be a paper of interest. And what you've seen is that when Marty Barron became editor of the Globe in 2001, the Globe had just gone through a downsizing, and yet they had about 550 journalists. When John Henry bought the paper, it was about 280. Today it's around 245 because Henry has said, I'm not looking to make money, but I don't want to lose money either. So he's had to do some cutting. Well, I think that what McGrory has said that he's dealing with is, how do you do the coverage that really matters with a smaller newsroom? And I think that they're struggling with it. I think they're trying to figure out, how do we concentrate on areas of interest rather than specific beats? And I think that's a really hard thing to do. What I find is that I think that some of their accountability journalism continues to be really good. I will often find 3 to 5 must-reads on a daily basis. And it doesn't have to be a big investigative piece. It can be a really good piece on the Red Sox as one of those pieces.
Yep.
But I do think that we've probably reached the point where if you're expecting a completely comprehensive report of everything that's going on in the city and the state, and you're going to have 25 or 30 really good stories on a daily basis, it's not going to happen. It just isn't going to happen.
And let me add some numbers to this. So I had a journalism professor who taught me, he goes, Ed, when you hear that someone's laid off from a factory, you still expect to sort of like get the same number of shoes. You figure, well, it's a robot doing them. When you lay off a reporter, if she wrote 90 stories a year, 90 stories vanish from your life.
That's right.
And Dan knows this because he teaches this, but like the average person doesn't understand, if the Globe has 190 reporters rather than 500 reporters, take the number of reporters and multiply it by whatever number you want, and you realize that thousands and thousands of stories have not been written, many of which may have affected your life or institutions you interact with or politics. Yep. So if the Globe, let's say 25 years ago, had 30 guys covering Beacon Hill full-time, and they wrote 700 stories a year, then now when you realize they write 150 stories a year. What were those 500 missing stories that you didn't get? And I keep telling everybody that you may not care about journalism, but you understand journalism is sort of the nervous center of a free society. It is the way that you know what everyone else is doing. And the problem is, as you cut slowly over the past 20 years like the Globe, people become inured to the cuts. You don't realize that there was a Globe that would have given them way more knowledge about what everybody is doing that is gone, but they don't even know it's missing because they haven't been brought up. Dan notices the difference because he's older than we are, but the average person...
I'm older than anybody is.
but Dan would remember that, hey, wait a second, I remember when the Globe were allowed by state government and they no longer do that.
Right.
So suddenly that people are getting away with corruption on Beacon Hill and no one even notices. The Globe cannot... For instance, we all know Bob DeLeo is running the House like an awful fiefdom, as Scott Lehigh satirized today.
It's actually a decent piece.
But the point is that the Globe can't muster the resources to stop this from happening. The Globe can't muster resources against the bad transparency, against the House of DeLeo.
Yep.
And it's because they don't have enough people aimed at the problem. Never mind the fact that their op-ed section can't get their act together and they persecute him for it, although Scott did a good job. But you want to say, like, we all have an investment in this. And I wonder, like, what happens in the future where we have various organizations that channel people and money into us understanding our own society. I think the Globe has this fantastic demographic as readership, wealthy, educated, and if the Globe can't figure out how to make money and cover everything, well, who can? We have a way better set of reader demographics than many other metro papers. Why can't John Henry and crew take advantage of all these wealthy, intelligent people, and why can't Linda Henry, who organizes Hub Week, marshal the elite at Hub Week into a way that saves the Globe? I mean, I'm just astonished the Henrys can't figure this out. I mean, so go ahead. What do you think the Henrys should do, Dan, going forward? Like, how can they...
I think to a certain extent, I think what they're doing makes a lot of sense. I think that the double moves that they've made, moving editorial to the downtown and printing to Taunton, is supposed to save them a lot of money, and that's money that they don't have to cut from journalism. And they've publicly announced that, okay, they now have about 84,000 digital subscribers. They're aiming for about 200,000. And if they can get there, they feel that they're a sustainable business. And at that point, maybe you can start adding some journalistic firepower back into the newsroom. It's possible. It's a big bet. There is no more difficult a space in the newspaper business than large regional papers like the Globe. They're all really, really hurting. The reason the Washington Post has done so well is that they were a regional paper more like the Globe than the New York Times.
But they're in Washington.
But they shifted to national.
And then they're in Washington.
Yeah.
Jeff Bezos comes in and says, guess what? We're now a national digital newspaper. And there is some room in the national space. But in the regional space, it's incredibly difficult. The Globe has been cut a lot less than most regional papers. I think that the challenge that you point to now, comparing the Globe of today back to when they had all these reporters at the State House, all these reporters at City Hall, is how do they do the stories that really count? How can they guarantee, and this is really hard, how can they guarantee that the stories that they miss will be the kinds of stories that are a kind of secondary or tertiary interest anyway?
They can't.
It's hard. It's very hard. By the way, you mentioned my advanced age. I'm going to pull age on you here. One of the very first media columns I ever wrote for the Boston Phoenix was in 1994 or 5, and I went up to the State House, and you know what the topic of it was? Whatever happened to State House coverage? Why does nobody cover the State House anymore?
That is a recurring theme from
this was 23 years ago.
Yeah.
And they were covering it way more than now.
Yeah, I suppose they were.
By the numbers, it has to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. By the way, one of the people I interviewed was Carolyn Ryan, the State House bureau chief for the Quincy Patriot Ledger, now a top editor at the New York Times.
Excellent. All right.
She's come a lot further than I have.
So one more thing.
All right. So you're wrapping this up.
Yeah, I know we're wrapping this up. So to our audience, you covered about bias and objectivity and the future in Boston. What can our audience do? How can they be better consumers? And if there is a future for all these Boston organizations, whether it's the Globe, the Westchester Reporter, whether it's PRX or WGBH, what does the consumer do both to consume and to pay for it all? What can our audience do to be part of the solution for media in this area?
That's a really, really good question. I mean, other than... it's hard to get beyond the typical cliches of saying they should avail themselves of a large range of news sources and they should pay for the sources they use. But I'm not really sure how to get much beyond that. That seems to be
Expect to pay,
key.
though. Expect to pay.
Expect to pay, yes.
I'm happy to pay. I'm a political citizen. I want to invest.
Yeah, but you're also older, so in each generation, they may not be thinking that they should pay.
I want to say, you have to invest in the society you want. And I want to say, subscribing to a newspaper is better than giving $20 to a politician. I'm sorry, Charlie Baker. I love you. I'm not giving you money. I'd rather give it to,
you're not
Neiman Foundation.
No. Let's correct something now. You're giving money to Charlie Baker, and I'm going to make sure that happens. There'll be fundraisers coming up.
Yeah, and I think we also need to be skeptical news consumers, and if something doesn't seem right, do a little bit more checking, do some Googling. Figure out if you can find out what the facts are. Now we're not really talking necessarily about what we see in reliable media outlets, but when your aunt and uncle are sharing stuff with you on Facebook,
those are the best.
Check it out.
All right. With that, Dan Kennedy, thank you so much for joining the Lincoln Review podcast. Shirley Leung, I'm dying to get you on the podcast. There's lots we want to talk to you about. Anybody at the Globe, but after many contentious debates on Twitter, I think Dan can agree that we are fair, congenial, and want an in-depth conversation about the issues, and it's not going to be a confrontational situation.
Absolutely. And thank you, Jeff and Ed. This was fun.
You are very welcome. Do not forget to subscribe to us on iTunes. Do not forget to subscribe to us on YouTube. We are now on the video platform. We are on all the podcatchers, SoundCloud. There's a few others that the RSS feed goes through. Hopefully SoundCloud stays in business, because if they go out of business, we're in a little bit of trouble. Anyway, as always, it's been a pleasure. Ed, I'll talk to you soon.
You too, Jeff. Thanks. And thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Ed and Jeff.
Good night. Bye-bye.